Lovely, delicious people. I am here today to review The Woman in the Window. Sounds like almost a little bit of a song, but going into this, for a lot of people who have maybe heard of movies like Disturbia, the Shia LaBeouf film, or any number of the Rear Windows that had reared their ugly head to you and said, "Hello, how about you watch this?" And you're like, sounds good. Going into this movie, we end up having us to go through the rabbit hole with a character named Anna Fox, and we end up finding out that Anna really isn't exactly all of a person that we can 100% trust. To where reasonably it makes what's going on with Anna suspect, to where we're just like, okay, crap. So is she really just an insane Looney Tunes person, or is what she is saying really and truly true, and there's evidence to back that up? And eventually, we'll figure that out by the end of this film. The thing that I like is it seems that a lot of people aren't actually who they seem to be. Where we end up having reasonably a lot of people that arrive within this movie who eventually, like a guy like David, who seems to be a guy that Anna is to live with. Like at first, it seems like and at first it seems like David is a fairly helpful guy, but then we realize there is a seemingly more to this guy's story. We end up having seemingly uh, a woman named Jane who ends up coming to uh, a woman named Jane who seemingly ends up coming to Anna's house that seems to be able to be all good and well and innocent and it seems that everything is going right with this family, but then eventually we end up finding out that Anna ends up watching a family fall apart through her window. To where eventually we end up having Anna, who now has to eventually decide later what is it that she actually did see. To where eventually we end up having Anna, who is getting very much paranoid of her neighbors for good reason. Going into this, we end up having also Anna having problems with leaving her home. And immediately once I see like a certain kind of like, oh, okay, this person has a problem with leaving their house. I'm like, well, there's always a way of which this story has to be done then. Because if anybody has a horrifying fear of something, guess what always happens? They end up getting still horrifyingly fearsome of it, and it never ends. Come on. So going on to this movie, I was kind of fascinated eventually how far gone Anna really is. Like I was really interested in how really just, oh, okay, well I guess that's not actually true. Oh, I guess, well, that's not actually, well, all right, now we're gonna get a little bit more backstory to help us understand things now. Okay, all right, like, meh, like, wow, that's good. That's interesting. So yeah, recently with this movie, I did really enjoy it. It was just the fact where I also felt like, man, this movie is also just kind of like slow, and I kind of wish that there was just a lot more going on with honestly Anna's neighborhood. Uh, like I just don't feel like she was busy enough. In all actuality, it seems like there was a lot of downtime within this place, and plus, really, this entire movie kind of does have to rely on one bad neighbor. Um, and I can understand that because a movie like Rear Window would do the same thing, but still. Um, like it would have been cool if there was more going on within this neighborhood, like little things here and there that we would end up finding out that Anna is just uh, the neighborhood snitch and nobody has figured it out. Um, like it would have been interesting if she would have had some kind of consistent legacy of that, and no one would have known besides maybe the detective to just be like, well, thanks again for you coming up with this uh coming up with this case for me. That would have been interesting if all of a sudden, like, we end up having it to where this detective would have been thanking her for yet another case solved. Because really, they could have had it to where, like, Anna could have been this, like, town snitch and no one would have known. And that could have been really interesting. We could have really had it to where this entire time she could have been playing off as whatever, and she could have been like a detective or whatever. Like, she could have been a former detective this entire time, and man, would that have been a way different story. Just like, oh my god, like, so like that's the reason why like she's been just kind of concealed in this whole time, just because she couldn't take being a detective anymore or whatever. Because, anyways, I'm trying to write a better story here, but it is what it is. So, yeah, I think that's all that I want to say about this movie cryptically. Let me know in the comments below what you felt about this film. Let me know in the comments below if you liked this film, hated it, thought it was stupid, whichever. But I think it's about that time for us to go on to eventually go into spoilers. If you have not seen this movie yet, go ahead and go out of your way to say that you've seen this film by going into Netflix. It seems like Netflix actually has legitimate movies to watch. What a coinkydink! Especially with Army of the Dead. And plus, also, it seems that this one is okay enough to actually be deemed watchable. Like, it's kind of surprising. It feels like Netflix is finally shelling out the big bucks to actually have content that is actually watchable now. That's great. That I can actually want to be able to go into Netflix right now and actually watch their content, because I could care less. Usually, I just go into an app that I can just watch whatever and watch this anyways. But it's good to just go back into Netflix and just watch this through Netflix. So, with that said, I think it's about that time to go out of our way to spoil this movie, because I think it's that coveted time yet again to say spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, we immediately have Anna, who seems to seemingly be a person that cannot go outside. So we end up seemingly having Anna, who is to be seeing a therapist, but also it seems that she is a counselor of sorts herself. That's how I guess she ends up getting the affordability to afford her home, is to eventually counsel some, I guess, younger uh, people, which I never actually see her do in this movie. I never actually see her do her actual job. So, like, maybe like she's retired, maybe she like made enough money to where she didn't need to actually do her job. I don't know. Like, I'm trying to figure that out, because I don't see her actually doing her job at any point in this movie, but it is what it is. Uh, Plus, also, it seems that we end up having her therapist talking to Anna about, like, hey, how do you feel about this neighbor? How do you feel about this neighbor? Because it seems that there are some neighbors of hers that are doing some church studies and stuff like that, and so on and so forth. And so it seems that Anna has, from time to time, been looking into her neighbors before this whole thing really starts popping off. So we eventually have it to where Anna is to uh, have a man that lives with her in this home, and he kind of lives in like the basement or the lower level of this home. And so we end up having it eventually where David is to come and to eventually help Anna kind of do some kind of handyman ish like things, or kind of come up there to like help her like uh, double check on some things or whatever, or just kind of confirm some things that he has seen the same thing as she has, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Anna is to eventually have it be Halloween. And we end up having David, who ends up coming up and asking her what she's going to do for Halloween. And we end up having it to where Anna is like, "Well, I do what I usually do. I just kind of like turn off turn off all my lights and not deliver candy to anyone, so that way everyone will just assume that don't come knocking at my door because I'm not going to open my door to anybody." So we end up having at first we end up having Ethan, who ends up coming to Anna's home. It seems that Ethan is a troubled boy. That we end up having Ethan mentioning to Anna that he has seen her look out at their home, at Ethan's home. We end up having eventually where Ethan is to talk about how he's allergic to cats and how things are kind of getting a little rough for him. And we end up having also Ethan asking what Anna does. She's a counselor for youth or whatever. So we end up having eventually Ethan, who is kind of really just trying to make the consensus of who Anna actually is. And eventually we end up having Ethan, who is seemingly getting a little teary eyed about what his life is at home, because I guess evidently it's not the greatest. So we end up having Ethan going home, and so we eventually have it to where here is Halloween. So we end up having, of course, seemingly a bunch of trick or treaters who all decide to go and egg Anna's home, and so we end up eventually having Anna, who is desperate to go out of her home to try to stop these people from egging her home. And so when we end up having Anna, who ends up opening her door, she ends up passing out. We end up having Jane Russell, who goes and greets Anna, just like, "Oh my God, like are you okay? Like, are you alive? Like, hey, let me know." And so we immediately have it toward both Jane and Anna are seemingly like making the best of friends of one another because of this whole situation. So we eventually have it to where Jane is trying to take care of Anna. Then eventually we end up having it to where eventually Jane comes back again after this whole situation, this scenario, and both Anna and Jane end up sharing a thing of wine together. And we end up having Jane, who is talking about her family and how she, of course, has a favorites, like her son means a lot to her. She has a photo locket with his face in it, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where eventually Jane is to eventually leave and go home, and so we end up having David, who ends up coming in to eventually tell Anna that he had cleaned the egg off the home, and that it seems that there is also some kind of problem with the roof. So we end up having David, who realizes that there's some mold on the roof, and so he tries to fix it or whatever. But a lot of the times we end up having also David like scaring Anna from time to time. Um, but anyways, we eventually have it to where eventually Anna is to look off onto her neighbor's home, and we end up having seemingly Anna having or Anna we end up having Jane having some disagreement uh, with someone, which we are led to believe is Alistair, who is Gary Oldman's character. We end up seemingly having it to where eventually Anna is seeing this disagreement, this argument, and eventually we end up seeing Jane, who is to eventually be attacked by something, some kind of weapon, to where we end up having Jane seemingly falling off to the side dead. We end up having Anna, who is to call the police and desperately try to get the police on the phone. And so we end up having Jane, who is desperately clinging to the window, and we end up having Anna deciding to try and make it outside her door. And we end up having it to where she ends up trying to open up a umbrella to hide underneath this umbrella to try to make it to Jane's home. And we end up having Jane, I think, passing out yet again to have her be propped back into her house, to where we end up having some detectives there. And so now let's scoot back a little bit. So we end up having it to where Jane is consistently talking uh, to seemingly a guy named Ed, who she is, of course, having a relationship with, who is Anthony Mackie's character. It seems at the very beginning of this movie, it's a very loving relationship where it seems to be a long distance relationship where we end up having Anna, who is telling Ed that, that she wishes that he was here, kind of thing, and all kinds of other like sweet nothings that he's telling this Ed. And so we end up having Anna, who is kind of telling this person what is going on, Ed, and kind of like seeing what he has to tell her and stuff along those lines. So we end up having it to where it seems that Anna is having quite a bit of conversations with Ed over the phone, getting consistent um, conversation with this person. So we end up having it to where Anna is to now be talking with these detectives, and so we end up eventually finding out that it seems that the Jane Russell that Anna knows is not the right Jane Russell. That we end up finding out that it seems that there is some other Jane Russell that is not the one that Anna knows. And so we end up having, of course, reasonably. Anna is at this point just realizing, oh my god, am I really this crazy? We end up having it to where the detectives are saying that there was actually no evidence of any kind of foul play or anything like that in this home. There seems to be another Jane Russell here, and that really Anna is not actually seeing or like everything that she thinks that she sees is not actually true. Plus, we end up having it to where Anna is not actually able to talk to a guy named Ed or her family of which that she had, because we end up having a flashback now where we end up seeing that Anna is driving with Ed and her daughter, driving to somewhere. And so we end up having Ed, who is to talk about stuff with Anna where it seems that this relationship is on the rocks. It seems that somebody had been having an affair or somebody had been cheating between the two of them. And we end up eventually having it to where it seems that there is an unknown caller on this phone, and we end up having Ed, who is to kind of haggle of who should actually answer the phone, and we end up having Ed who says like, well, how about I answer the phone? And we end up having Anna grabbing it from him, flinging it out of each other's hands to eventually have Anna go and drop the phone in the back of the car, to where we end up having Anna both drive and try to find this phone, and we end up having Anna causing a accident of sorts, which ends up killing both Ed and Anna's daughter. So the entire time, the person that she was to have talked to within this movie is dead. So the whole entire conversation that she has been having does not actually exist. So, wow, I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. So, we go along here, and so we end up having Anna realizing that Ed is gone, but she's still trying to pull at strings to try and see if anyone is to really be telling a lie or not. We end up having Ethan, who eventually tells Anna that Anna is crazy and that this mother is actually really and truly his mother. And eventually we have Anna, who desperately calls for Ethan to come to her home to tell her the truth. We end up having also Anna going to David to try and ask him if he had spent any time with this first Jane. Because here's the thing, we end up having Anna, who is to go down to where David lives, and eventually we find that David has some letters, and we end up having David, who ends up opening his door to come in and be like, hey, like, what are you doing with my mail? We end up finding out that it seems that David is on probation and that he had went to prison before this. And we end up having David, who's like, yeah, it was a simple mistake, and I'm going to correct it. I'm going to correct it soon. So we end up finding out that kind of David is kind of a little paranoid, because he doesn't want anybody to really know that he's on parole, or like, so basically David is trying to say whatever he needs to say for him to not be in any problems with police or being involved in any kind of case of any kind, because this guy's on probation. So we end up eventually having it to where Anna eventually goes into David's room yet again, because it seems that her cat had went all the way down to David's room. And so we end up finding out that Anna is to find in David's room the first Jane's earring, which eventually she says is her favorite. So we we eventually have it to where Anna is talking to David, or is talking to, not David. We end up having Anna talking to Ethan, and we end up having Anna, who's desperately trying to have Ethan spill the beans, tell the truth, whatever. And we end up having it to where Gary Oldman, Alistair, is to eventually come in, smack his son off on the face, and to tell him to go home. And we end up having it to where Alistair is basically threatening Anna to leave his family alone and to stop bothering them. We end up having Anna at some point pulling out her camera and consistently putting shot after shot, kind of, and zooming in, watching things go on into this home, to where eventually we end up having the second Jane Russell calling Anna to tell her that she needs to stop looking into their home. Because it seems that Anna was given Ethan her phone number, and eventually also it seems that people in this house knew Anna's phone number. So we go along and we end up having it to where Anna is asking David about this first Jane, asking him if he had seen her before, and he knew good full and well that they had to have spent time together, and eventually they had probably had sex together, in something along those lines, because her earring was found in his room. Like, it's obvious. So we end up having eventually David, who has to forcibly spill the beans of, like, well, yeah, like, sure, like, I did spend time with this woman, and, like, her name actually isn't Jane, it's Katie. And so we end up having David, who confirms every little bit of stuff that Anna is saying. But it was also kind of interesting that we end up having Anna, who's doing a paper trail on Alistair, and we end up finding out that it seems that a lot of Alistair's assistants, of his business, ended up winding up dead. Like, that I think was really interesting, where we consistently found uh, every one of seemingly Alistair's assistants dead one after the other. It was a weird, mysterious thing. But because we also have it to where Anna had a photo of Jane. Well, technically, it wasn't an actual photo of her. Her face reflected off of some wine glass, because we end up having it to where Anna was taking a picture of her cat, uh, like, being close to these wine glasses, and we end up finding out that Jane's face was in some reflection of the wine glass, to where Anna says, like, yeah, like, I did I did see this girl on this day, and look, like, she's actually in the photo of the wine glass. And so we end up having David, who's like, well, yeah, like, okay, let's spill the beans since you have evidence now. Like, yeah, the thing that you said was true. That I did see this girl, I did sleep with her, blah, 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 blah. So we have it to where David now has hard evidence, or really Anna has hard evidence that what she has seen was true. And so we end up having also, like, Alistair, who is kind of like a douchebaggery like person. So immediately we are thinking, considering how abusive he is, that Anna is coming up with a consensus that Alistair was the one to have killed the very first Jane, and to hide her away, to store her away, and everybody else was just corroborating with his story. But what we actually don't find out is actually it wasn't Alistair this entire time. It wasn't. So we end up having Anna, who, before she was thinking of her being at all correct, we end up having Anna, who is having David leave her home. And so we end up having Anna, who starts to or has an appointment with her therapist, and she is to have her therapist tell her, it's like, well, we should really increase these sessions together, and this and that. And we end up having Anna, who is thinking that she's going more and more crazy. And so we end up having Anna, who ends up doing a video basically saying that after David is to have left her home for good, that Anna is going to do herself in, take her own self out. And we end up having Anna, who mixes a bunch of drugs together to eventually take after David leaves. So we end up having Anna, who ends up going on to a cell phone and making her last will and testament video, to basically tell everyone that she is uh going to end herself, and that she is going to do what she's going to do because of stuff here and there. So before Anna goes through with this, we end up having Anna who does one last thing and gets that photo, confirms with David, and then eventually we end up having it to where we end up finding out that when David is to go down his stairs, we end up finding out that David is to be knifed. Hmm. We find out that Ethan had made his way into Anna's home, heard about the video that she had done, and I guess Ethan was going to not only kill David, but eventually kill Anna, and probably say that it was a murder suicide or murder self harm or whatever. So we end up having Ethan who is to basically just say like, well, hey man, like you set everything up with me with that video. Like, thank God that you did that. And so we end up having eventually Ethan explaining everything, how Ethan was actually the one to have actually hurt his mother, and maybe we end up having Alistair who might have covered it up. We're not sure 100% on that territory whether Alistair covered it up, or uh, I don't know. Like maybe we have it to where Alistair might have knew his son was the way he was this entire time, and that Alistair just kind of covered for him. Hence why Alistair was very abusive to Ethan. Maybe even Alistair was just like Ethan. Who knows how far down the rabbit hole this family goes, of how disturbed they are. But anyways, we end up having Ethan who is to tell that he had killed his own mother, and that I guess let's just say Alistair covered up for it. And so we end up having Ethan who had been playing Anna like a fiddle this whole entire time. That really he wasn't this emotionally disturbed kid. That really that was just an act to feed to her, and so on and so forth. To eventually, I guess maybe Ethan had a consistent string of him killing his neighbors. Maybe that's just what he does. So we end up having it to where eventually Ethan is spelling all of this out to Anna. And so we end up having, of course, Anna who is to basically just say, well, like, I guess there's only one thing to do. And so, because we end up having Ethan who is to basically say, yeah, how about you go and you take all those pills because you were going to do that anyways. And just kind of like finish this up for me, because Ethan probably is going to stab her anyways and kill her. So we end up having Anna who's like, okay, fine, like I'll go and I'll take my medication and I'll do myself in, and no one will ever know. So we end up having Anna who ends up taking a drink of her wine filled with drugs. And then immediately we end up having Anna who ends up desperately trying to run off, to try and run to her upstairs. Eventually we end up having David trying to grab on to Ethan to eventually get stabbed again and to eventually, I guess, really get killed. So we end up eventually having Anna who is to eventually in desperation try to be able to call 911 and have someone help her, protect her, and whatever. And so we eventually have a. Oh my god. How did this movie exactly end? Oh my god. I know that eventually it takes place with eventually Anna eventually in the hospital, but how did exactly we get there? Oh my god. Ugh. How exactly does this movie end? I might have to pause here to figure that out because I forgot how exactly it ended. I got all the build up to that point, but then eventually it stopped at some point. Uh I might have to pause here. I might have to pause here to figure this out. All right, I'm like, didn't they do something with the roof? And then I was like, oh yeah. So good God, I was immediately like, how do we transition to the end of this movie? Because I was like, I know the ending, the very end of the movie, uh, to where the detective is talking to Anna in the nurses hospital place, but the nurses hospital place, yeah, the hospital. That's the word to use there. Um, but I just didn't know how we got there. So here's how we got there. So we end up having Anna, who ends up going to the roof, and of course, Ethan is to follow. We end up having Ethan, who is to eventually, of course, do the psycho knife happy. We end up having Anna, who ends up having the perfect thing to have Ethan's knife go in, besides her, to eventually have disarmed Ethan, and eventually we end up having it to where we end up having this like chase around the rooftop, but eventually uh, we eventually have Anna who ends up going and tossing Ethan on top of this glass what is it called? Like it's a rooftop piece, but it's made of fully fledgedly like pour glass, which we end up having David, who mentioned was very moldy before. And so we end up having Anna, who keeps like pushing Ethan to try to get him through this glass, to where he ends up falling through the glass, and then he ends up falling down these stairs, and he ends up getting this thing called dead. We end up seeing Anna, who is on the rooftop, just kind of desperately breathing for air as it is just pouring down rain on her, to where eventually we end up having Anna, who is now revived at the hospital, and we end up having this Detective Little, basically telling her that she was right all along, with the exclusion of her dead husband that she was talking to, and that it seems that he had seen her video that she was going to do, that she was planning on doing. And so we end up having Detective Little, who is asking Anna, like, hey, do I have to worry about you now? Like, should I, like, am I think that after this whole situation, you're going to be okay, kind of thing? And Anna's like, yes. Like, and so we end up having Anna, who is mentioning to this detective, she's like, well, like, what are we gonna do about the video? And we end up having Detective Little saying like, well, like because of what all kind of happened, you know what? Like, if I give you your cell phone and you can delete anything that you want off your cell phone, just letting you know now, you can do anything with this cell phone to delete anything. I will give this to you, and then I will come back for it in an hour to ask for it, and then eventually we'll carry on with things, letting basically like this detective is basically saying like, hey, if you want to delete this video, like I'll say that I've never seen it in my life before, and everything will be okay, and you'll still be uh like everything will still be like that she was correct all along, because really also like some people could probably make a case that this woman still wasn't like rationally sane this whole entire time, and and plus, like Ethan could have been dead for any number of reasons. Maybe Anna could have gone after David, and then Ethan. Who knows? There could have been any number of kind of situations where um, Anna could have been a person that could have been having some kind of motive or something like that to have her be the killer. But still, it was Ethan at the end of this, which I was perfectly fine with. Going into this movie, I kind of was like, there was some kind of parts of me that I was kind of like, you know what? Like, I felt kind of good watching this movie. I was surprised because I was thinking that this was going to be like a really slow, awful movie that I couldn't have cared less for. But then eventually, it seems that eventually we get a little bit of story here where I'm like, oh, okay, I like this part. Like, okay, this wins me over. And after we have Anna, who is to eventually be done with the hospital, we end up finding that Anna is completely okay with leaving her home, which I'm like, yeah, of course, that's like exactly what happens with this movie. We end up having Anna who ends up saying goodbye to both Eddie and her daughter, or Ed and her daughter, and then she ends up leaving the home to, I guess, move out. And I'm like, well, yeah, like, of course, like, that's of course what she ends up doing at the tail end of this movie is being 100% fine with leaving her home. Because I'm like, yeah, I guess after that traumatic experience, I guess her fear of leaving her home was the last thing on her mind, I guess. So eventually she ended up conquering her fears to eventually leave her home by the end of this movie, which I'm like, yeah, of course that's what happens in this film. But yeah, like I was kind of won over by this film and I wasn't expecting to. I was just kind of going like, man, this is probably going to be a boring movie, but I actually got won over by it. There's like a lot of specifics that I just kind of really glazed over and kind of rushed through within this movie just because reasonably there's a lot of times where there's a lot of dialogue in this movie that kind of feels like a lot of nothing. In all honesty, so reasonably, like it's trying to rush through this movie a lot to get through it, review it, and be done with it. Just because, really, there is like some really interesting story, but then there's also a lot of common talk that I could not really exactly care for within this movie. But that always happens with films. A lot of times you get this dialogue where you're like, why should I care? Why should I? Like, I just want to get to the cool parts. Let me get to the cool parts, and I'll be fine with that. So this movie has that quite a bit. So with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie, this review, and so on and so forth. I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.